Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, How COVID Has Changed Latin American Economics. This is one of a continuing series at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies on how COVID has changed Latin America. And I'm Fran Hagopian. I teach in the government department at Harvard. I'm the Lemann Senior Lecturer on Government there, and I co-chair the Brazil Studies program at Doctor Class. And I am co-moderating today's session in this series with my two very valuable colleagues. First, Alicia Holland. Alicia, do you want to say a word?
Hi. Hello, welcome everyone.
And my boss, my jefe, Steve Levitsky, who is my colleague in the government department, my colleague on many dissertation committees, and the director as of September 1st of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Steve?
Hi, everyone.
We do this in front of the spectacular Dr. Class staff. Everything that goes right today will be because of the hard work that they have done and are doing behind the scenes as I'm up front speaking. And everything that goes wrong will be because I've botched it and Alicia and Steve haven't caught me in time. Without further ado, we have an all-star panel. We always have great speakers at Dr. Class, but today we're especially proud of the all-star panel that we have put together for this event. Our panelists are not only world-class scholars in their field, but they have ample experience in the public sphere and in the policy world. And that experience ranges from state governments to international institutions with national governments in between. They bring expertise from the largest countries in the region, and they have region-wide knowledge, deep knowledge and expertise. I would like to present them to you now in alphabetical order, which is the order in which they will speak. First up will be Daniela Campello, who is a professor at the Fundação Getulio Vargas in Rio. She was, before she moved back to Brazil, an assistant professor in the politics department at Princeton and at the Woodrow Wilson School for International Affairs there. Her expertise is on international and comparative political economy, and her work is particularly focused on the consequences of economic internationalization on domestic politics and democracy in emerging economies. She's the author of an absolutely fabulous book, The Politics of Market Discipline in Latin America, Globalization and Democracy, and she is at work right now on another book with Cesar Zucco, also at the Fundação Getulio Vargas, on economic voting and democratic accountability in Latin America. Before she entered academic life, she had worked as a business consultant at Accenture, and she also worked for the state government of Rio, where she managed projects that were funded by international financial institutions. Second up will be Gustavo Flores Macias, who comes to us from Cornell, where he's not only teaches in the government department, an associate professor, but he's also associate vice provost for international affairs at Cornell, and he's the author of two great books. The first, After Neoliberalism, The Left and Economic Reforms in Latin America, is a prize-winning book. It won the Latin American Studies Association's Tomasini Book Award in 2015, and he also edited The Political Economy of Taxation in Latin America, which came out from Cambridge last year. His PhD is from Georgetown. He has a master's in public policy from Duke. He was a Fulbright scholar, and he previously served as director of public affairs in Mexico's Federal Consumer Protection Agency and as director of Cornell's Latin American Studies program. Steve, I guess this means that after directing Dr. Class, you're headed for the provost's office. And he is a faculty fellow at the Atkinson Center for Sustainable Future. He's received Princeton's Democracy and Development Fellowship, and as you might expect from someone with such expertise, his work's been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, The Hill, CNBC, and Fox News, among others. So, third up will be Ana Maria Ibanez, who comes to us from the Universidad de los Andes and also the IDB. She's a professor at the School of Economics at the Universidad de los Andes. and she's currently on leave working as principal economic advisor at the IDB. Her research focuses on the microeconomic analysis of internal armed conflict, the economic costs of crime and conflict, as well as the consequences and the causes of forced displacement. Things that I just, how you work on things that are so unimportant. I don't know. She has studied the dynamics of land concentration, the informality of property rights, and its relationship to conflict. So she brings to us a perspective that we don't often get, which is just terrific for this conversation today. And last but not least, we have Andres Velasco, who is also, you take great scholars and you put them in administration. He's the Dean of the School of Public Policy at LSE. And he was in 2017, 2018, a member of the G20 Eminent Persons Group. He co-chaired in 2015, 2016, the Global Panel on the Future of Multilateral Lending. In 2013 to 2016, he was a member of the Global Oceans Commission. And he was I said these guys had experience in public life. He was the presidential candidate in Chile, in his native Chile, in 2013. He was also Minister of Finance in Chile between March 2006 and March 2010. He was professor of professional practice and international development at CEPA at Columbia University. And he was a professor of international finance and development at the Harvard Kennedy School for 6 years. He was with us during that time. Before that, he was at NYU. His accomplishments go on and on and on. Let's just suffice it to say that he's worked at the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB. He's advised governments, central banks, and private businesses around the world. As I said, this is an amazing panel, and I'm embarrassed, actually I'm humiliated to limit each of them to 10 minutes in their initial presentations. But if we can do that, then we can free up about 40 minutes for discussion and for your questions. And before I hand the mic over, however, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First, we are recording today's webinar. It will be available to you on the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after today's session. We will also email a link to the recording to everyone who has registered. Second, we do hope to see you at other lectures and series that we host here at Dr. Class. Next week, we'll be continuing another one of our series this semester, which is Democracy on the Line. And next week up will be Democracy on the Line in Brazil. In the chat, we have added links to our online calendar as well as social media channels. Please do follow us there for the most up-to-date information on upcoming events. And while we would love to hear from you during this presentation, you can't actually do it via the chat. You can see what's there now, but the chat function will be disabled. So the way to ask your questions of these esteemed panelists will be the Q&A function on your Zoom screens. So we will be collecting these questions. I will be doing this along with Alicia and Steve, and we will allow the panelists to go through their initial presentations, but please feel free to put your questions up at any time during their presentations, and then we will collect a few and pose them back to the panel. So without further ado, since I've asked these folks a series of many questions that I've asked them to speak about in 10 minutes, without further ado, I want to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Daniela Campello. Dani?
Thanks, Frances, very much. Thanks for the invitation, the David Rockefeller Center, Frances, Alicia, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be again with Gustavo, Flores, Macias, Andres Velasco, and Ana Maria Ibanez. So I'd like to start by giving you some background on Brazil's political and economic conditions when the pandemic hit, which I think matter a lot to understand where we are and where we're going. So from an economic perspective, Brazil was in the middle of a crisis that started a few years earlier. and about 2011 with the reversal of the commodity super cycle, and from which it had never recovered. So I feel we are still in the hangover of the very good times of the 2000s in Brazil. So the Brazilian particularity compared to other countries in the region was the dramatic drop of President Dilma's popularity that followed the economic downturn opened a window of opportunity for the opposition to sack her from office with a fiscal maneuver that was controversial to say the least. So with the impeachment, Brazil opened a Pandora box, normalizing this procedure not only at the federal, but now also at the state and municipal level. So I have the Rio de Janeiro state governor is being impeached, and they're trying to impeach the mayor as well. So political stability was not restored after the impeachment, harming the country's long-term perspectives, discouraging investment. Temer, the vice president of Dilma, who replaced her, was extremely unpopular and deeply involved in corruption schemes. And this had basically two effects. It affected the certainty about the length of the presidency, and it increased the costs of political support in Congress. So some expected this uncertainty to end with a new election, fresh new government. Yet the long and deep economic downturn, coupled with a widespread corruption scandal, the very well-known Lava Jato operation, led to a profound disbelief in politics and politicians, broadly speaking, created the conditions for the election of a politician like Jair Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro, as for most that know about Brazil, is a fringe legislator whose career was basically to act as a unionist for the military in Congress, nothing else, and who was successfully sold as an outsider with vague promises of changing it all in Brazil. So Bolsonaro was elected with this very clear populist rhetoric that did not disguise contempt for institutions of the Brazilian democracy, but his populism was coupled with the promise of a radical neoliberal agenda, Menem style, which promised to sell more than 200 billion worth of state assets, fix the country's fragile fiscal position, and advance the administrative reform that would dramatically reduce the size of the state in Brazil. The rationale was it's very well known in Brazil. We call this the confidence fairy. So Bolsonaro, aka Paulo Guedes, his finance minister, former investment banker, expected that this agenda would boost investor confidence and investment flows to the country, allowing it to benefit from historically low international interest rates. Turns out that this investment never resumed to Brazil after all these years of uncertainty, most probably thanks to Bolsonaro's erratic policies in every single area you think about. Neither did the promise of acceleration of economic growth. So political and economic uncertainty since Bolsonaro have been only reinforcing each other after his inauguration. So in early 2020, frustration was already driving his popularity down when COVID hit. So things were bad in economic perspective. From a political perspective, and popularity of Bolsonaro was reaching very low levels. His strategy in dealing with the COVID mimics Trump's. So he minimized the pandemic. He tried to promote an early return to normality to boost economic recovery. He even tried to have TV ads conclaiming people to go to the streets and go back to work. He discredited health specialists. He demonized state governors for ignoring what he calls like workers' reality. And the crisis brought his popularity even further down. It's interesting because you see the movement of Bolsonaro's popularity went exactly the opposite of most leaders in the world. So everybody had some kind of honeymoon effect of like everybody together against a common enemy. Bolsonaro didn't, but now he has been recovering. But anyway, so Brazil now is the third highest in deaths per million inhabitants in Latin America, only behind Bolivia and Peru. So we have 664 deaths by million population. If you count Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, we have twice this rate. So it's a very serious pandemic right now in Brazil. So I'll go directly. I mean, it has done not so much on the health side, but let me talk about the economic responses to the pandemic. So I divide in three categories. One is credit support for small, medium companies, in which Bolsonaro spent $9 billion. Support to salary reductions, $9 billion as well. So there was an agreement with the companies that companies would not fire people. They could reduce the salaries and the government would compensate for that. This agreement ends in the end of this year. So companies will be able to start firing these employees in 2021. There was some financial help to states and cities, $14 billion, but by far the most importantly was the government's plans to spend a total of $57 billion in an emergency cash transfer program to the unemployed and informal workers that supposed to reach close to 70 million Brazilians. Initially, the program the initial proposal of the government was to pay $36 per family in Brazil, but thanks to the Congress to pressure, this program, which is called Renda Emergencial, was paid from $107 to $215 per family for 3 months. And more recently, the president issued a decree reducing the payments to half until the end of the year. So this starts the decrease in this payment starts in September. So just to put in perspective, analysts project the Brazilian primary deficit this year to be 153 billion, 12% of gross domestic product in Brazil. This means that the emergency cash transfer program costs almost half of the Brazilian primary deficit. So one cannot overstate the impact of this program. There was an unprecedented fall in poverty. Poverty now in Brazil is at the lowest level in 40 years in the middle of the pandemic. So this is huge. For the poorest and most vulnerable groups in the population, income actually increased after the pandemic. So let me tell you some figures about this program. So thinking about income from labor, there was an average wage loss in Brazil of 20%. That amounted to 28% among the poorest Brazilians and 10% among the wealthiest, as usual. Native Brazilians, 29% wage loss. The wage Gini in Brazil went from 79% to 82%, and unemployment increased 9%. After the transfers, there was a complete reversal of the situation. So we went from having 50 million poor people to 39 million in a few months. The extreme poor went from 8.8 million to 4.8. The smallest share, as I said, in 4 decades. The Gini went from 56 to 47 in Brazil. The prediction, what the analysts anticipate, is that after the reduction of this amount, is not even like canceling the program, but just having the amount paid by the government, we will have again 11 million poor people added to this group, and 5.7 million in the extreme poverty, which means we're going back exactly to where we were before the program started. It's a kind of a makeup of a situation in Brazil, and even the GDP in Brazil apparently fell less than was expected thanks to this amount of money that was transferred from the government. And the Gini is supposed to go back to 50 as the program ends. So even though the program was sponsored by the Congress, as we all know from the economic voting literature, recipients attribute the benefit to the federal government. People complain, journalists complain, analysts complain, but we know that this is how this works in presidential systems. So not surprisingly, we observed a major reversal of the fall in popular support of Bolsonaro. So mostly driven by the northeastern poor, which used to be the Workers' Party constituency, at least since 2006. And as a result, Bolsonaro now has the highest rate of approval since his election, close to 40%, which of course shocks everyone that knows what's going on in Brazil right now and the size of the pandemic and the disaster in the Amazon and so on and so forth. But still, these were people that had an increase in their own income after the pandemic. We need to consider the size of this measure. So it's important to emphasize that this 10% increase in Bolsonaro's popularity were the most expensive in Brazilian history. So just to compare, whereas the emergency cash transfer spends around 50 billion reais per month, the Bolsa Família program, that was the Bolsa Família program of the Lula government, costs around 30 billion a year. So it's 50 billion a month against 30 billion a year. So if Brazil couldn't afford a program like this one during Lula's good times of the commodity super cycle, it's really hard to believe that it's sustainable in a fiscal crisis as deep as we are experiencing right now. One thing that is important to mention is not that Bolsonaro suddenly became very sensitive to social problems of Brazil, because while he was spending this amount of money, he spent like only a third of the budget for the COVID, only a third of the budget for human rights policy. So it's not that he cares about this. It's just it's a funny situation. It was an accident because he wanted to pay much less, but suddenly he realized that this means popularity and eventually may mean vote, and he wants to keep the program, of course. So my scenario pre-COVID was that low growth and low popularity would mind Bolsonaro's support for his super economic minister Paulo Guedes. Post-COVID, this looks certain. So since elected, Bolsonaro has been slowly moving away from the agenda that gathered elite support to his campaign. He has been actually losing popularity among the elites. The anti-corruption agenda of Sergio Moro and the neoliberal economic agenda of Paulo Guedes. So now the president is at the crossroad, with investors on one side demanding fiscal austerity, at least after 2021. There's some patience, but the patience is ending. And voters on the other side expecting the improvement on material conditions to at least persist. So after having fired Minister and Judge Sergio Moro without any major loss of political support, to me seems very possible that Bolsonaro will decide at some point to replace Minister Paulo Guedes with someone that has a profile of like economic expansion, public works, the military who back him, have this very nationalist, expansionary perspective. We know that some people believe that this had changed in Brazil, but I always thought it was really funny to believe that because they have been like this ever since. So now the point is, it's interesting. It may not be news for Americans, but it's a president that doesn't want to govern. He wants to be reelected. So it's not everything about reelection 2 years before the vote. So actually, this matters. The increase in popularity matters for reelection, but also to make sure that he's not impeached, which is still in the scenario, because Bolsonaro has a very fragile and very expensive basis of support in Congress, not programmatic at all, which is very sensitive to public opinion. So he and his family are investigated in a series of corruption charges. There are, the last time I counted, 55 impeachment processes waiting to be put to vote in the Brazilian Congress. So it's a very fragile situation. He's somehow a hostage of the Brazilian political system and what we call the centrão, the very physiologist parties of the Congress. So even though the fire of Guedes has been small talk for a long time, there is little evidence that has already been incorporated in market prices. It's not unlikely, thus, that the replacement triggers a major confidence crisis in the country once it confirms Bolsonaro's willingness to abandon an expenditure cap that we adopted a few years ago. So looking back to history, we know that, and wrapping up, we know that when resources are scarce in Latin America, the temptation to advance on sustainable economic policies is very strong, but the consequences are also very well known. So some insist on calling Bolsonaro the right-wing Lula thanks to his new cash transfer program. But I think that besides the low quality of his team, the scenario today could not be more different than the one experienced by Lula, marked by the commodity investment boom and a very, very favorable international scenario. So expansionary program adopted right now under these conditions will probably lead him to a scenario more like Alfonsinho or Alan Garcia and not the 85% of support that Lula. So just a curiosity, after concluding this speech, I just learned yesterday night that Bolsonaro now finally announced plans how to fund the expansion of the Bolsa Família program, now named Renda Cidadã, and he wants to use resources from education funds, which are not subject to the expenditure cap, complemented with funds obtained by postponing the payment of lawsuits that the government had lost. So some have already dubbed it fiscal MacGyvering, others just call it a default. And markets, of course, responded immediately. So to conclude, I foresee major economic and political instability in Brazil in the next few years, driven by an election-oriented expansionary program that will attempt to overcome this expenditure cap without explicitly confronting it. All of that under a very unfavorable international scenario. So I just don't see where the V-shaped recovery that the government has been selling will come from. And with that, I finish.
Okay, go ahead. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dani. And now Gustavo.
Thank you. I'd like to start also by thanking Harvard Rockefeller Center for the invitation to participate in the panel. It's a treat for me to get to see Fran, Alicia, Steve, Dani, and to get to learn from Dani and Maria and Andres. I really appreciate the opportunity. In the time that I have, I'll try to make the case that the region should further the adoption of more ambitious countercyclical policies to address the COVID crisis. So I'll be talking about the region in general with some examples from specific countries. And I'll start by discussing first the magnitude of the crisis, some of its social consequences. Second, I'll speak to what governments are currently doing. And finally, I'll say a few words about the implications of not fully committing to these ambitious countercyclical measures that I'm suggesting, including potential consequences for democracy in the region. Now, we know that Latin America has not handled COVID well. There are more than 9 million confirmed cases in the region, more than 325,000 deaths, or about a third of deaths recorded worldwide. Now, for reference, Latin America has no more than 10% of the world's total population. That is, of course, generalized underreporting in the region as well, so the real numbers are likely much higher. Now, how has COVID affected the region? Well, the IMF projects the region's GDP to shrink by 9.4%, with almost every country experiencing a recession. Unemployment is expected to reach 14% of the region's labor force, if not more. And we know, of course, that unemployment figures in the region paint an incomplete picture because of the size of the informal sector. Oil producers have been affected by the sharp decrease in oil prices, including Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, even Brazil and Mexico. Countries whose economies depend heavily on tourism have seen drastic decreases in hotel occupancy and international arrivals in general. Just to give you a sense, occupancy rates in Caribbean countries, for instance, have reached 10% in March and April compared to the previous year, and they've struggled to recover since. Layoffs as a result of the pandemic and the sluggish economic recoveries in the US and Europe have also precipitated a decline in remittances in many cases. In places like Ecuador, Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras, for instance, remittances initially dropped between 20 and 40%, although we see some signs now that they may be returning to pre-pandemic levels. The exception may be Mexico, which has suffered, at least in this regard, it has been, I guess, the country that hasn't suffered as much. And Mexico might even come up on top with some increase in remittances this year. But for a country like El Salvador, where remittances represent a fifth of its GDP, even a 10% drop in remittances can have pretty important consequences. Now, a significant reduction in the demand for Latin American goods coming from China and from industrialized countries has also severely impacted manufacturing industries, maquilas, export of primary goods, depending on the country. Now, the early macroeconomic indicators already reflect the extent of the damage. Brazil's GDP is expected to shrink by 9% this year. Mexico's economy will contract by at least 10%, which is worse than the peso crisis in 1994, when the White House extended a rescue package to avoid sort of this economic collapse from the southern neighbor's economy. Peru's production is expected to drop by 14%, a decline that has been characterized as comparable to that suffered during the War of the Pacific in the late 19th century. So for many, if not all countries, this will be the worst economic downturn in almost a century since the Great Depression. It is still early to tell whether these forecasts will further deteriorate, potentially bringing economic hardship not seen in generations in Latin America. Now, these trends will bring important social consequences. They represent important setbacks in terms of reducing both inequality and poverty in the region. Inequality will certainly worsen in what already was the most unequal region in the world. According to the UN, poverty levels will deteriorate from 30% of the region's population in 2019 to 37% in 2020. And I think that's an optimistic scenario. So to put it bluntly, this means that 45 million people, 45 additional million people will join the ranks of the poor due to the economic impact of the pandemic. And women, by the way, who tend to be overrepresented in poor households, will be especially affected by this. Some governments already reporting increases in malnutrition rates among children aged 5 and under, as in Guatemala. So what should we do about it? What should governments do about this? Well, previous experiences with economic crisis have shown that ambitious counter-cyclical economic policies are necessary to alleviate the extent of decline. For example, from the Great Depression, we learned that an ambitious fiscal stimulus and lax economic monetary policies were necessary to put money back in people's pockets and that way reactivate the economy. These same types of policies proved to play a crucial role diminishing the negative effects of the global recession in 2008-2009. Now, government responses in the region have been short of this standard. To give you a reference, in India, right, another developing country, big developing country, its stimulus package has exceeded 10% of that country's GDP. Brazil and Chile have committed 8% and 5% respectively. Colombia's emergency fund is less than 3% of GDP. Mexico has even followed the opposite direction, making austerity a priority. Now, governments' reluctance to adopt ambitious fiscal policies is understandable, perhaps, given the region's history of recurrent crisis. Right? Investment grades have been hard to achieve. The specters of hyperinflation, currency crisis, capital flights are still present. Again, this is understandable, but inflation is not a major concern for most countries in the region. Obviously, Venezuela, Argentina set aside. The debt to GDP ratios provide quite a bit of room for maneuver this time around. However, government inaction could unnecessarily prolong the decline of the region's economies, as we saw during the Great Depression, the 1997 Asian crisis, where austerity made things worse. So some countries' obsession with austerity can be compared with the medieval practice of trying to heal the patient through bleeding. Now, the costs of timid government responses could be steep, right? Not only for the economy, but also for people's livelihoods. Well, let me say a few words about the political realm. Economic crises have been responsible for major transformations in Latin America's recent history, right, including the wave of populist leaders that reached power in the aftermath of the Great Depression, or economic emergencies during the 60s and 70s that contributed to the emergence of military dictatorships. And in turn, the debt crisis played a role in these regimes, the authoritarian regimes' collapse during the 1980s. We can also think about austerity measures, severe austerity during the 1990s and early 2000s, that made possible the advent of Chavismo and other populist governments. So unless governments adopt broader measures today, the region's fragile democracies could be among the victims of the pandemic. In the last decade, people's disenchantment with the government's ability to solve society's problems has increased considerably, from sky-high levels of violence to the lack of economic opportunities. So while 61% of Latin Americans expressed a preference for democracy over authoritarian regimes in 2010, 61%, Latinobarometro puts that percentage at 48% in its 2018 survey, which I believe is the latest. In Brazil, in Mexico, several Central American countries, less than 39% of the population expresses support for democracy today. At the same time, militaries have gained considerable political influence in recent years. Right? In Brazil, they hold close to half of the positions in Jair Bolsonaro's cabinet. In Mexico, soldiers are in charge not only of public safety and customs, but also major infrastructure projects like the Mexico City airport. In El Salvador and Nicaragua, presidents rely on the armed forces to intimidate political rivals. In Chile, the military is called on to call protests. In Bolivia, the military played an important role in Morales' resignation. And the list goes on. But the militarization of the public sphere is especially worrisome in light of the military's legacy of repression in the region. So this is certainly not the moment for governments to keep their powder dry. They should instead make use of any and all economic policy tools at their disposal to ameliorate the impact of the crisis on the population. And since about half of the region's labor force is in the informal sector, it's important not only to support the private sector, but also put money directly in people's pockets through social programs, right? The spending that Danny was just alluding to in Brazil, but also investment in infrastructure, health, and education. And for their part, central banks should redouble efforts to make credit available to businesses and continue with what has been a trend, I think, of this lax monetary policy they've been increasingly adopting. Otherwise, right, in the context of this generalized disenchantment with democracy and politically active militaries, a major economic crisis could be the last straw. In the wake of the pandemic, the region will be poorer, it'll be more unequal, it'll have more debt, and it'll probably also be more polarized. So if civilian governments prove to be unable to address the economic crisis, fragile democracies in the region could return to the path of authoritarianism. So I'll leave it there. I appreciate everybody's time, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
What a perfectly timed presentation that covered an amazing ground, is going to give us a lot of opportunity to engage in discussion after the presentations. Thank you very much, Gustavo. I'd like to turn now to Ana Maria.
Thank you, Fran, and I hope you're seeing the presentation. And thanks everybody for the invitation today. Let me put the presentation up. So before starting, I would like to thank Dr. Klaas for inviting me today, and I'm thrilled to be sharing this panel with my fellow panelists. As Gustavo mentioned, Latin America and the Caribbean is today the center of the pandemic. I don't want to repeat the figures he already provided, but would like to stress one that I think is very important. Our death rate is far worse than the world. Whereas we have 53 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, the world has 13 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. The short-term economic and social impacts are significant, and the extent of these are yet unknown for the region. And I would like to concentrate on two dimensions that are particularly worrying for not only the short term, but the long term as well. COVID-19 and the economic crisis that is unfolding is having devastating consequences on human capital accumulation, which will not affect only our current conditions, but also the future economic outlook on the region, and will have profound consequences on inequality if we do not act now, as Gustavo already mentioned. I will concentrate my initial presentation on this topic, and in particular on the death toll caused by the pandemic and the losses in education. Yesterday, the death toll from COVID in the region was near 340,000 deaths. And in addition to the deaths caused by the virus, the burden due to excessive pressure on the healthcare system may cause additional deaths. Besides the emotional toll from these deaths, COVID-19 is hindering human capital accumulation, and this falls disproportionately on the poor population and certain age groups. So I would like to illustrate the extent of this impact with some figures of our work that we are doing for Peru with Maria Adelaida Ortega and Norbert Shari. This graph shows the excess deaths for Peru. So here is the deaths for 2018, 2019, and 2017. And when you see the death rate when the pandemic started, the effect is huge. So death rates are today 4 times higher than in usual times. And although the death toll has been significantly higher for people between 60 and 69 years of age, here I divide the graph for different age groups. The death rate for people between 25 and 39 years of age has doubled. For those between 40 and 49 years of age has increased almost threefold. And for those between 50 and 59 is 4 times larger. So besides the unsurmountable loss of one person's death, people in the most productive years are dying, with the consequent effect on present growth, and also with the consequent effects on inequality, which can be really high. These graphs illustrate how the death burden falls disproportionately on people for low education levels. This is the probability or the risk of dying due to COVID or any death. And what you see here is the red line for the low education people and the high education people. Before the pandemic, it was almost double the risk. But even after the lockdown, the risk for the lower education people is 1/3 higher. And this higher risk of death conflates several dimensions of inequality. Higher comorbidity among the poor population, worse sanitary conditions, and a large participation in informal labor markets, and also more frequent occupation on manual jobs. So this last graph seeks to summarize the toll on human capital for Peru for all these excess deaths. We estimate the foregone years of life by comparing the average foregone years of life before the pandemic erupted. So this is for an average for 2017, 2018, and 2019. And this is the foregone years of life after the pandemic for 2020, the red line. And for calculating the foregone years of life, we compare the age of death and the life expectancy at that age. And here what you see is that these are all the additional foregone years of life, this area here, for Peru due to the pandemic. And the effects, as you can see, are dramatic. Human capital losses will not only have an effect in current GDP, but also on future GDP. The long-lasting effects might be significant and may persist for decades. And I think this is really worrisome. The losses in education will drive these long-lasting impacts. Figures for the losses in human capital through education have not been carefully estimated for Latin America and the Caribbean yet. However, we can anticipate these losses will be large. A recent report on inequality led at the IDB, led by Matías Buzo and Julián Messina, which I really highly recommend, provides some initial evidence. Last semester, around 154 million students did not attend school, and this is happening this semester as well. The region was not prepared to move swiftly to virtual education. Virtual education is difficult to implement, more so with teachers of bad quality, instruction material of bad quality, and little capacity of many schools to monitor these students through time. In addition, access to the input required for virtual education, I will say the minimum inputs required for this virtual education, like a good teacher, computers, and internet access, is highly unequal for Latin America. And here I'm showing some figures that appear in the report. So rich will receive good education, and poor will receive education of poor quality at best, or no education at all. And these are some pictures of a project of enumerators that are conducting a survey in Ecuador of children really trying to have access and to connect to the classes, to their classes. Kids and parents, as I say, are doing immense effort to connect to their classes, yet some are not being able to collect or do so in very difficult conditions. So you can imagine the capacity of these kids to learn with these difficult conditions. The above and the sharp drops in household income increase the risk of kids dropping out of school. And again, a study done by the IDB showed that this risk may increase by 17%, about 1.2 million kids. And in regions with high levels of violence, what we are seeing is criminal organizations trying to recruit these kids to work in the criminal organization. So as I mentioned before, currently there are no studies which allow us to estimate the extent of these human capital losses that the crisis will cause through education. However, some figures like the ones I present in this slide hint to significant losses. And these losses may partially erase the efforts of the region has undertaken during the last decades, and may persist for decades if ambitious mitigation and remediation policies are not put in place in the next coming months. So decisions like getting money out from education to this conditional cash transfers program, like Daniela was mentioning, it's really not a very wise decision. As for health, the effects are falling disproportionately on students from low-income families, and this is going to deepen even further school and education segregation. The impact of COVID-19 will deepen inequality in the region, as Gustavo already mentioned, and this is a region with the highest inequality in the world. Again, as I say, the IDB report that was just published shows the extent of this inequality on several dimensions. And I will not go into the analysis of inequality, but would like to flag two issues that I think are very important. The first one is the structural causes of inequality, the inability of governments for really implementing redistributive policies, the pervasive informality on labor markets and small firms, and a lack of competition culture are some of the causes of inequality and the factors that sustains it. So to reduce inequality, we really need to tackle these causes. And this is not going to be an easy task. It will require political consensus in countries with a very polarized political environment. Second thing that I would like to highlight is that despite the progress on reduction on inequality and access to social service, there is still a long way to go. We are still the most unequal region in the world, and the declining trend on inequality reversed during the last years. In addition, the expansion of social services has not been really accompanied by the improvement on quality of these services. And all this is paired with something that already was mentioned by Daniela and Gustavo, and these rising political tensions in the region. By the end of 2019, all of us know, many countries face intense political demonstrations of citizens angry at the lack of equal opportunities, fearful of an uncertain future, and discontent about the quality of services. So although the demonstrations intensified in 2019, it had already started in 2011. So some final thoughts to close my initial remarks is that it is no mystery that the large inequality in the region paired with the negative effects of the pandemic may result in a deep social, economic, and perhaps political crisis. And the action is really urgent, and we should avoid at any cost to return to the world before the COVID started. A world of slow economic growth, weak institutions, and lack of political will to undertake the reforms that we need to undertake. So some of the things that we need to discuss, and I'm not going to read it, is how to achieve really a dynamic growth and which are the policies that we should implement to control pervasive market power, which fiscal policies should countries adopt to promote redistributive capacity, and how to improve the access and quality of social services. And the last message that I would like to convey is that really economic growth and social progress go hand in hand together with social stability and trust in the social contract, which is not present at the moment. And we really need to do all this discussion, think that this is a political discussion that needs to be really addressed through the democratic process, and it's not only a series of economic reforms. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Maria. This brought exactly the perspective we were looking for. This was amazing. Thank you so much. Andres, while you get your slides up, I just want to say the pressure's on. So whenever you're ready, please begin.
Oops, we start again? Okay. Can you hear me now? Brilliant, thank you. Thank you to Dr. Klaas for the invitation. I spent some very, very happy years in Cambridge, Mass. I was closely associated with Dr. Klaas, so it is always a pleasure and a privilege to participate in your great activities, and very, very happy to be sharing not the stage, but the screen with these eminent scholars and very provocative thinkers. Like Gustavo, I want to talk about the region as a whole. Ana Maria also talked about the region as a whole. I will more or less carry out in the same trend. And I want to talk mostly about economics, but also talk a little bit about politics toward the end. And I will say at the outset that my conclusions will be a lot less clear and a lot less definitive than some of the things we've heard so far. I suspect there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot that at least I don't quite understand. And there's some very, very hard questions going forward, which as far as I can see, do not lend themselves to easy solutions. But that's probably too vague. It's probably not helping you understand. So let me just jump into the fray. So, as Gustavo said already, this is not one shock for the region. This is really 5 shocks. The first one is COVID, and you know, I'm a macroeconomist. I do crises. Crisis is what pays my wage at the end of the month. And I've seen many crises in Latin America: financial, banking, unemployment, debt. We have never seen a crisis in which people were told not to work and in which firms were told not to produce. So this is entirely new. In addition, and I will say this quickly because Gustavo more or less went through it, we've had a massive drop in trade volumes, a massive drop in commodity prices, although some commodity prices recovered. In the summer, they're beginning to fall again. We've had lots of services simply vanish. Tourism is the most obvious of them all. Gustavo also mentioned remittances, particularly for the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico. These are very, very big items indeed, and they amount to yet another shock. Last but not least, and I think this has not been mentioned, we had some months of huge capital outflows from the region. April, the beginning of May were the biggest months, I mean the worst months ever since we have data for capital leaving the region. Since then, we have a more mixed picture. The private sector is probably still taking its money out, but the governments that can borrow, Colombia, Peru, Chile in particular, Panama also have been borrowing a lot. So you have a net flow that is about 0. Bottom line is that you know, financial conditions in the region have been very, very, very tight, very difficult. On the left, you see you know, the spreads on Latin American debt, much, much higher than anything that we saw during the world financial crisis 10 years ago. And on the right, you see the extent to which currencies have depreciated. Some currencies, particularly the Brazilian real, have depreciated a lot. And let me immediately rush to one of my punchlines. the fact that Brazil is so badly hit when it comes to the currency is, as they say in the UK, not unconnected to the fact that the fiscal situation in Brazil is becoming quite tenuous, and that is worrying a lot of people, as it should. Now, it is obvious that governments should take a very active role in response to the crisis. There's a role in helping families that have lost their incomes. There is a big role in keeping firms alive by allowing them not to sever employment relationships, what in the UK they call furlough schemes. And eventually, not at first, but eventually you also want to stimulate aggregate demand because people are spending less, going out less, and firms are investing less. Unlike Gustavo, and I can say this as a student of macro policies in Latin America for a long time, I'm prepared to argue that the fiscal response and monetary response has been pretty large. It's been very uneven. So some countries have done remarkably little, but some countries have done a lot. In fact, if you look at previous crises, world crises or regional crises, Latin America was always well known for doing exactly the wrong thing. That is to say, when the world went belly up, Latin America would have to tighten because that was the only way to keep the currency from tanking and inflation from getting out of control. This is the first crisis ever. Maybe the Great Depression had a bit in common, but not much, in which almost every country in Latin America has let loose when it comes to monetary and fiscal policy. The odd man out, or the odd country out, is Mexico. Latin America is always giving us contrast and peculiar stories that we don't know how to explain. Daniela explained to us already why a right-wing populist like Bolsonaro is doing a very expansionary fiscal policy. I would be eager to hear somebody who could explain to me why a left-wing populist like AMLO is doing a ridiculously tight fiscal policy. This simply does not make any sense. But if you look at Colombia, you look at Argentina, you look at Chile, you look at Peru, you look at Brazil, fiscal policies have been pretty expansionary, more so than at any other time in the last 80 or 90 years of Latin American history. Why have they not been more expansionary? Well, for the simple reason that a number of these countries don't have more money. Peru and Chile and Colombia can borrow from international financial markets. Argentina cannot, Uruguay cannot, Brazil is kind of at the verge. I heard my friend Mauricio Cárdenas, who used to be the Colombian finance minister, recently say, in Europe, they're doing whatever it takes to keep the economies afloat. In Latin America, we're doing whatever we can. And parenthetically, this goes to show that the effort mounted by the IMF, the World Bank, and Ana Maria, with all due respect, the IDB is way too small. This is one moment when the international financial institutions really had to step up to the plate. They have not. The IDB, expanded lending from 10 billion to 13 billion, that's really peanuts. It really is peanuts. So if countries haven't done more, simply because they don't have the hard currency to do more. And those that can, Chile, Peru, and Brazil have done a fair bit. Now, the results have not been great. They have not been great when it comes to the contagion, and they have not been great when it comes to the size of the recession. You have the paradox, for instance, of a country like Peru, which has spent 7 points of GDP in fiscal transfers. 7 points of GDP. I don't think a country in Latin America, with the partial exception of Brazil today, has ever spent so much. And nonetheless, you are getting an economy that is tanking and a situation of contagion that is very much not yet under control. And I think a fascinating question is, why is it that in Latin America, the results when it comes to containing the pandemic have been so poor? And I think the honest answer is we do not know. But let me just put a few things on the table to feed the conversation. One argument might be that some governments came too late to the party, and that's partially true, but that's not universally true. Countries like Argentina and Peru did very severe lockdowns early on. Another comment might be that you did a severe lockdown, but there wasn't much enforcement. And this is true. This is true particularly in Peru. I work with a Peruvian economist who likes to show a picture of the main market in Lima before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and the number of people on the street is exactly the same. But this is not simply because governments are weak. It is because when 60 or 70% of the labor force does not have a formal job, you can tell people to stay home, but if they don't have any income, they simply cannot stay home because some guy carrying a sign in Bogota, in a picture you've probably seen on the internet, you know, the letrero said, "I'd rather die of the virus than die of hunger." And that is a very, very dire and very difficult situation. To some extent, and this is my number 3, part of the problem has been that a lot of money was dispersed in countries like Brazil and Peru, to some extent Colombia and Chile, but it was not clearly made contingent on staying home. You could imagine sort of a virtuous cycle here in which you give families a lot of income, but you do it in a way such that you keep them at home. In some cases, the money was not enough. In some cases, the way it was dispersed was not so great, because in Peru, for instance, a lot of money was dispersed, but because most Peruvians don't have a bank account, they had to go line up to pick up the money. So you get the money, but you probably get the virus as well. As it was mentioned already, the fact that the labor market is very informal has been absolutely dismal. And with the weak health infrastructure explains something, but it doesn't explain everything. For instance, it doesn't explain why the African continent, which is just as poor or poorer than Latin America, and which has much worse health infrastructure, has done better. It doesn't explain why, for instance, you know, you look at Pakistan and India, 2 very poor countries with pretty weak health infrastructure. Pakistan is doing fine and India is doing dismally. So a lot of the usual suspects here don't have a lot of explanatory power. I think we have to be honest and confess that we cannot be quite sure why the results in Latin America have been as dismal as they have been. How fast will the recovery be? I think the honest answer is we also don't know. To some extent, it depends obviously on how quickly we get to contain the virus, and that is becoming very uncertain everywhere, including the US and the UK. Secondly, the longer the crisis lasts, the more it begins to look like a structural shock and not a cyclical shock. What do I mean by that? Well, if it's short-lived, a lot of businesses will be harmed, but they will not disappear. If it's long, a lot of businesses will simply be put out of business, and a lot of sectors will find that they are no longer viable. Think of air transport, think of entertainment, hospitality, you know, hotels, theaters, et cetera, and those will not simply, you know, reopen business as usual 3 months from now. Many of them will simply have to be reinvented. And that means that jobs will be destroyed. Eventually jobs will be created, but we know that jobs are destroyed quickly and they're created slowly. And that will mean a period of pretty slow recovery, I think. Last but not least, and I am certainly not you know, very conservative on debt. On the contrary, when I was finance minister of Chile, you know, I probably went on the biggest spending binge that Chile had ever seen. So believe me, you know, I'm a Keynesian through and through, but even a Keynesian like me can worry about debt levels. And I think we should remember that Argentina and Ecuador just defaulted. Rating agencies are looking at a lot of countries, and I think Brazil is probably first on the list. Brazil this year will cross the threshold of 100% of domestic output in gross public debt. That's the same as the UK and the US, parenthetically. The difference, of course, is that for a number of reasons, Brazil is a great deal more vulnerable. Another way of putting this is that, yes, we'll see some numbers that suggest a quick recovery because, you know, after a huge drop, you can be growing at +5, +6, +7, and you're not quite there yet in recovering the levels of output that that region had, say, at the end of last year. One summary statistic is this: except for Uruguay, no country in Latin America on December 31st, 2021 will have the same activity levels it had on December 31st, 2019. So even with what looks like a fast recovery, activity will remain depressed. And if you look on the right, and this is a real downer, I think we will see massive unemployment in the region for a long time. And don't forget that this is also coming at a time when the robots are showing up in Latin America. So you have the cyclical shock, the structural shock of the pandemic, plus massive innovation when it comes to automation. I think this is very bad news for employment in general. And of course, I mentioned the debt business already. I don't want to get stuck here. Issues for the future. I think that countries that had a reasonable fiscal position to start with have greatly benefited. The fact that a country like Peru has managed to do what it's managed, what it's done, is a testament to the fact that Peru went into this crisis having only 28% of GDP in public debt. The fact that in Argentina, for instance, the situation is so tenuous today is to some extent the result of the fact that Argentina was in the middle of a debt crisis, has been printing pesos like there's no tomorrow. And believe it or not, in Argentina, again, people are talking about not only a COVID crisis, but yet another financial crisis or yet another inflation spike. And of course, going forward, how much fiscal space there is anybody's guess. Let me just add one thought. Fiscal space is easy to come by as long as world interest rates are very, very low, because you can have a lot of debt, but the carrying cost of that debt is not very high. So if the US and the UK and the rest of the world keep us in a universe of zero interest rates, then maybe there is some fiscal space. If the world begins to go back to a situation in which interest rates are something like normal interest rates, the fiscal space in Latin America is going to vanish overnight. And there, any talk of additional stimulus, I think, is going to basically also vanish overnight. Thought number two is that for a long time, we should have known that Latin America's big weakness is in the labor market. You cannot think about inequality in Latin America without realizing that Latin Americans have vastly unequal access to good jobs. And of course, this crisis has reminded us of how terrible it is to have informal labor markets, among other things, because simply you cannot tell people, please stay home if there's no wage that the government can subsidize because there was no labor contract to begin with. In some countries, the labor market is so informal that governments don't even have roles, computer files that allow them to get to people with cash transfers. So this is something that we really have to be thinking as we go forward. And point number three, I mentioned already, the world really comes up short here in terms of the ability to get money to countries that needed it. One word on the politics. I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to containing the pandemic, the populists have been completely and totally inept. And here, Brazil and Mexico, a right-wing populist and a left-wing populist get the applause. I guess, you can be left-wing or right-wing, but still think that you're too macho to get the virus. We saw that in Brazil. We saw that in Mexico. So not only is it shameful politically, it is criminal, because tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people will suffer hugely as a result. So in my mind, the big question is, when we come out of this crisis, are the populists the net gainers? Because as in the case of Bolsonaro, they've spent a lot of money. Or is the performance of populists so dismal that the voters will say, enough of these guys, let us punish them at the polls, let us find people who are more reasonable and more interested in governing, not simply in running a permanent campaign. I don't know what the answer is to this, but let me end with the following analogy. Sometimes when you come out of a crisis, you are in pain, you've suffered, the losses have been huge, but the country comes out feeling more united and with a sense of common purpose and a common destiny. I am in the UK. I've been reading, I've been locked down in the UK. I've been reading a lot about London. The last time Londoners were locked down, that was 1941, 42. And what you learn is that the UK came out, of course, devastated from the war, but with a real sense of common purpose. Contrast that to, say, 2010, when, as an economist, I'm perfectly prepared to say that someone like Obama was quite good when it came to the technical design of policy to deal with the crisis. In fact, the crisis could have been much, much larger. However, the political reading of that was that, Wall Street got a bailout, Main Street got nothing, people lost their homes. And that reading gave us Trump, gave us Bolsonaro, gave us Orban in Hungary, Duterte in the Philippines. The list is long and it is very sad. So will it be like 1945 or will it be like 2010? I wish I could say it's going to be 1945, but I fear it's going to be 2010. So we may be seeing more populism, perhaps in Peru, perhaps in Colombia, perhaps in Chile. And of course, we have populism in Argentina, Brazil, and Peru already. I have not mentioned Venezuela, but which is, of course, given the world a lesson in populism. Bottom line is, politically, I think we're looking at a very difficult time for the region as a whole in the years to come. Let me stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andres. If you can take your screen down now. And while you're doing that, I want to thank everybody on the panel. You know, I asked these impossible questions, but what we were looking forward to was being informed about what the impact of COVID had been on the region's economies. And the panelists have been so successful in answering those questions that I think we're all now even more depressed than we expected to be before we heard these presentations. What we've heard is a situation that is dire, and many of the questions in the chat are asking what the exit is from this situation. I'm going to just put out 3 questions, and not every panelist has to answer every question because we don't have time. But what I would like is to direct some questions to different panelists that we have gotten. So the first question comes from Dani, and she's asked it of Gustavo, and Andres has made the same observation, and that is, we have a right-wing populist in Brazil, we have a left-wing populist in Mexico, but we have a big spender in Brazil, and we have, I loved her analogy, Herbert Hoover in Mexico. Gustavo, what is going on in Mexico that AMLO is turned out to be the small spender in this time when governments, as Andres have said, have been opening up the cash register? Secondly, we had a series of questions in the chat. People are open, persuaded that some kind of countercyclical policies are necessary, that a lot is going to have to be done to overcome the human catastrophe, which is unfolding before us in Latin America. But with these kinds of debt burdens, is this feasible even? And if the United States and China enter into a trade war, I mean, what is going to be possible? And the last question comes from a former student of ours, Nicole Pauli Piedra, who watches both Peru and Brazil and is become an expert in education in Latin America. And Ana Maria, she was particularly interested in your presentation about the loss of human capital that we are experiencing in Latin America in the education sector as a result of this crisis. And she wonders what kinds of policy instruments are at government's disposal now to do something about this other than the cash transfers that we've seen in some countries like Brazil. So maybe we can start with Gustavo, and then maybe we can go on to Ana Maria, and then Dani and Andres, if you want to say something about what kind of policy instruments or counter-cyclical policies, what can be afforded, that would be great. And so if everyone can keep their comments pretty short, I would appreciate it. And so would the other folks who have questions who they'd like to have answered. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. About Mexico, you know, I think we can think of Brazil and Bolsonaro and the spending there as more in line with what we would expect from populists. In the Mexican case, I mean, I don't know if one can distinguish between the populist rhetoric and populist policies, or maybe pro-poor policies. I think the case of AMLO in Mexico is perhaps one in which we have populist rhetoric, but a lot of the policies are not pro-poor necessarily. And there's in AMLO's discourse, sort of this sacrifice takes a center stage, right? So just recently, just yesterday, he was chastising a public official who resigned, and then he was basically publicly condemning that he wasn't cut out for public service, and you know, this isn't for everyone. You really need to, you know, be cut out for a low-paying job and sacrificing, and that's what the country demands, right? So I think there's a lot of sacrifice, and at least these policies are consistent with that in AMLO's discourse. let me just say a few words about the issue of what alternatives we might have. And to Danny's question and others having to do with, well, you know, levels of debt are such that I mean, the region is really constrained. Just to be clear, this is a terrible scenario for the region, right? I mean, there's no easy way out. But I think the choices might be, unfortunately, between, you know, a scenario in which we think of the patient really going into critical condition and unleashing sort of a chain of events on the political realm that might end democracy in the short term, or we can worry about, you know, maybe these things down the road and think that they're not real threats and focus more on preserving debt levels. I think there's quite a bit of room, and I completely agree with Andres that there's a lot of variation in the region. So this won't apply to every country. And I'll set aside again Argentina and Venezuela. But even if we think about some of the main economies in the region, you know, Brazil is up there with upper 70% of debt to GDP ratios. So that's pretty constrained, although there's some space. But if we look at Mexico, Colombia, you know, they're under 50% of debt to GDP. If we look at Chile, Peru, under 40% of debt to GDP ratios. So I'm not arguing that, you know, this is the best path forward in normal times. I think given the current circumstances, and if one does believe that saving the patient now is critical because the political consequences are dire, I think there is some room for debt in here.
Great, thank you. Ana Maria?
Thank you, Fran. So I think we have at hand a lot of policies that can be implemented and need to be implemented fast. First, the ones that are quite basic are still using the conditional cash transfers to avoid kids dropping out of school, which are extremely important. And also that seems very basic, but is extremely important, is that teachers continue in contact with the students to prevent them from dropping out. Secondly, I think it's very important to start mitigation and remediation policies because students are really having low quality of education. In a study that we're doing right now at the IDB with Cerrando Brechas, which is a study in Ecuador, what they are finding is that students are connecting to classes, but they are spending much less time in education. So we really need to implement mitigation policies and remediation policies such that students can recover what they have lost during the pandemic. Something that is also very important is that the public sector, public education in Latin America is really not able to cover all students. So we have also a private sector that not only provides education for high income students, but for middle income students as well, and low income students as well. And these schools are really facing very dire financial conditions. So it's important to provide credits to this school, subsidized credits, so that the schools continue to operate. Otherwise, we will have a flow of students from this private school to the public schools, and the public schools might not be able to attend all those students. In the long run, I think it's important to stress that we really need to invest in the quality of teachers and in the quality of education, which is really an important thing in Latin America. So we need to improve teacher quality with incentives, with evaluations, and with a lot of policies that are very important.
Okay, thank you. I want to give Dani and Andres a chance to weigh in on the debate, but I think I'd like to ask Alicia, who's standing by, to toss out another question or two, and then we will go to Dani and to Andres first. Go ahead, Alicia.
Great. Well, thank you for all the presentations. I have two questions to throw out to you guys. So the first is, I think there's demand to end on a positive note. And obviously there's a common phrase, don't let a good crisis go to waste. So are there any opportunities for what you would consider positive economic and structural reforms that could come out of the pandemic? And then my second question, building off what Danny said, is that, you know, Latin America wasn't just emerging from its hangover around the commodity super cycle, but also from its hangover around a massive corruption scandal with Odebrecht. So as reports of corruption around the emergency contracting done for COVID supplies emerge, and as we think about the types of stimulus packages that will be promoted, what do you think the political effects of corruption reports are going to be on the region, and what new transparency measures might be needed to improve the spending of whatever stimulus countries do manage.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Why don't we go to Donnie first and then to Andres, and then we're going to have to wrap up, folks.
Okay, so let me be fast. So one concern I had with Gustavo's presentation, and Andres pointed out to this, is the fiscal space. And of course, it's a problem. And you mentioned in the 30s that we managed somehow to get out of the crisis, but we managed to get out of the crisis cutting off any ties with the international economy and defaulting on the public debt. And 2008 was not our crisis, right? We were in the middle of a commodity boom. Commodities went up, interest rates were down, and everything was relatively fine, and we were able to spend it out of the crisis. 1980s, we had a huge crisis in IMF conditionality, putting pressure on not spending. Right now, it seems that's pretty much the same situation. If you look at Costa Rica and Ecuador, the countries that have already gone to the IMF, it's the same story of the 80s. So we don't have savings from the good times, and we have the pressure of international institutions. So I don't see, I think it's a great claim, and we have to think about this, and we have to think about systems like Chile's, for example, in which you can save in the good times and then spend, which is something that there's a huge resistance in Brazil about that. I've been trying to push this debate for a long time, and people say, well, it's not the same thing, it's not only copper, it's a much complex economy, you cannot do that. So we don't save, therefore we cannot spend it out of the crisis, and that's a problem. In the case of Alicia, the corruption, my concern is that the one certainty I have about politics after this crisis, that there's going to be a huge anti-incumbent sentiment, and I don't think that's going to be restricted to populists or others. It's just going to be anti-incumbent and possibly anti-democracy, because we know that support for democracy goes down with the economic crisis. So corruption scandals, more corruption scandals, it's going to be more outsiders saying that there's something outside politics. So it's a big concern. Somebody mentioned China, and I think that China is a serious, it's our way out of the crisis could be China. But right now in Brazil, we are in the middle of this China-US situation and trying to push China away, which is the opposite that you would expect. So I'm not that optimistic. Even with the recognition of the problems of corruption, I think they're going to lead to more anti-system politics than before.
Perfect. And Andres, the last word.
Oh my God, what a responsibility. Let me be a boring economist for a minute. Counter-cyclical policies are there to counter the cycle. But I think we're moving from a problem that has to do with a cycle to a problem that has to do with the structure. It is much more lasting. And you can borrow your way out of a cyclical problem. You cannot borrow your way out of a structural problem. So I am perfectly happy, and in fact, I encourage the governments of Chile and Peru, for instance, to go on a spending spree. That was exactly the right thing to do. But more spending alone is not going to be the answer, particularly in countries where I think the precipice is not that far away. Brazil does not have 70% of GDP in debt. It has 100% of GDP in debt. You know, as a macroeconomist, I ask myself the question, will employment be higher in Brazil if the fiscal policy is laxer or if the fiscal policy is tighter? And I'm pretty sure that the only way to get the economy, you know, to remain somewhat healthy is to fix the fiscal situation. Not overnight, not over the next 24 hours, but certainly within the next 12 months. That may take, by the way, higher taxes. I am not necessarily advocating only spending cuts. And I think a fascinating question will be, not only in Brazil, in Colombia, and in Chile itself, how much appetite there is for higher taxes. I think we will certainly have to have higher taxes down the road. On populism, populism has nothing to do with pro-poor policies. Populism is a style of politics that pits one group against the other, the elite against the people, or the people against the foreigners, the migrants, etc. So in that sense, AMLO is a perfect populist. Not only is he a perfect populist, and rhetorically speaking, he's also a singularly inept and ignorant one, because if there was ever a chance to engage in expansionary policies, this was it. And if he didn't do it, I doubt it is because he's worried about Moody's or S&P saying nasty things about him. It is simply because I think he does not understand how the economy works. And that is tragic for Mexicans. Add to that his increasing attempts at weakening political and democratic institutions in Mexico, and I suspect we have a very, very bad situation. Let me end on a more positive note. Alicia said, come on, there must be some good news somewhere. Let me suggest two bits of good news. One is that I don't think globalization is over. I don't think international trade will collapse, but there will be some reshoring. There will be a lot of companies thinking, I was making these components in China or in Vietnam. Maybe I would like to make them closer to home. I think Mexico and to some extent other countries in the Caribbean basin are potentially thinking. Colombia is sort of gearing up. I'm not quite sure Colombia will get much of a reaction, but Mexico could, El Salvador could, some countries in the Caribbean could. In addition to this, some countries in Latin America, I'm thinking here of Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, are countries which have accumulated a fair bit of human capital in recent years and have no place to put it. So the supply of professionals has grown more quickly than the demand for professionals because economies haven't grown very quickly. So you have a lot of people with PhDs who can't find a job. Well, Zoom may be the answer. Many people, many professionals in Latin America, they begin to do exactly what we are doing now. We know that radiologists in Bangalore are reading X-rays from New York. Well, maybe radiologists in Montevideo or in Bogota will be doing exactly the same thing. I know of architectural firms or engineering firms in Latin America that are doing projects in China today. I know of financial services consultants and accountants that are specializing in U.S. accounting law and providing services in the Northern Hemisphere. Much of Latin America has one great advantage in this regard. If you live in Santiago, it happens to be the same time of the day as it is in New York. And therefore, many people can provide high value-added professional services in real time. There's one barrier here, not that many Latin Americans speak English. That's going to hold us back. But I think there is an opportunity here. And I'm not just thinking of low-tech, people answering calls at Walmart. I'm thinking about high-value professionals, whether medical doctors or financial specialists or engineers or architects. There may be a silver lining in the crisis here. So that's my attempt at being optimistic. Thanks very much.
To the contrary, let me thank all of the panelists. If you can all join me, however, virtually, to thank everybody for an amazingly informative panel. And may there be better times ahead. And next week, I need to close now. Remember to come back next week for Democracy on the Line in Brazil. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of the day.